Hello and welcome. In this lecture video, I'm going to talk about source documents for job order costing. At a high level, I'll talk about some journal entries to record materials, issue materials to production. I'll also talk about time cards, the flow of documents in a process costing system, and then also manufacturing overhead. So as I was saying in the earlier lecture video, a job cost sheet tracks materials, labor, and overhead so the total cost of a job at a high level. So I'll say right over here, job cost sheet tracks direct materials, DM, direct labor, DL, and manufacturing overhead, MOH, for each job at a summary level. Then, of course, the accounting department is going to be using those job cost sheets to determine the total cost of a job, and then also the cost of goods sold, finished goods, and work in process, the cost of those as well. Okay? So the next source document that I want to talk about is the materials requisition form. So the materials requisition form, so we'll see right over here, is used to request the release of DM, direct materials, and IM, indirect materials, from the warehouse. All right? So basically we get a sales order, and then we want to start to work on the sales. We want to turn that into a job, and so we start working on it. And we have to call the warehouse and say, we need 5 boxes of screws and some plywood and some 2x4s to make whatever we're making here. And so that materials requisition form is used to ask the warehouse to send us our direct materials and our indirect materials. Now, remember, direct materials go to work in process, but indirect materials go to manufacturing overhead. Okay? Indirect materials are part of manufacturing overhead. Direct materials, we're going to go straight to work in process. All right? Each material requisition is listed in summary form. So we're not going to be saying we had 5 boxes of screws on the job cost sheet. We would get that detail from the materials requisition form. On the job cost sheet, we're going to be saying, here's the total cost of materials. Okay? Not that kind of detail. So 5 boxes of screws, that would come from here. So this is, you can think of this as supporting detail for the job cost sheet. The job cost sheet is showing our materials cost at a summary level. This is the detail showing you these are the exact materials that we actually had, that we actually requested from the warehouse. Now, in terms of some journal entries, when we purchase raw materials, so remember we have our raw materials, RM, raw materials, and that contains the cost of our direct materials and our indirect materials. Okay? And then, of course, our direct materials move out of raw materials to work in process, but our indirect materials move from raw materials to manufacturing overhead. When we purchase raw materials inventory, we debit raw materials because raw materials is an asset. The way that we increase an asset is with a debit. So we debit raw materials, and then we credit cash if we paid for it immediately, or we credit accounts payable if we put it on the credit card. Okay? In terms of issuing materials to production, there's a typo there, we debit we debit work in process for the amount of our direct materials, and we debit manufacturing overhead for the amount of our indirect materials, and then we credit raw materials. Okay? So this would be an example of our materials requisition form. The other thing that we need to talk about are time tickets, which are just time cards. We can say used to track labor costs. In terms of our journal entries, we would debit work in process for our direct labor, debit manufacturing overhead for our indirect labor, and then we credit wages payable. Okay? And then, of course, once we pay it, we debit wages payable, and then we credit cash. Now, there's some valuable internal controls that we need on our materials requisition form and on our time tickets. We need a valid job number, and then we also need a supervisor's signature, okay? So basically what this is saying with the valid job number is that the job has to exist. So we have to have job 257. That already has to exist. We have to have a client for that job. It has to be set up in the database. And then once it's set up in the database, then people can start charging their time to that job. But until it's set up and it's valid in the database, in the system, people can't start charging their time cards to that job. The other thing that we have to have is a supervisor's signature. So when I worked in industry, I was not in a manufacturing setting. I was in a service setting. I was working for an IT consulting firm. And I was a financial analyst, and I remember sitting down with my manager one time, and he had to go through and sign all of the time cards for his direct reports, for his employees. So I was sitting in the office and sitting right across from him, and he was sitting there signing them. And the interesting thing is that he could tell just by looking at the time card, and this is back in the late 1990s or so when we still had paper time cards, not time cards on the computer. So they were paper time cards, and he was signing them. And I remember him saying, well, I can tell that this person hasn't done their time card on a daily basis. You're supposed to do your time card on a daily basis. The pay period was 2 weeks, so you're supposed to do it every day, and then at the end of 2 weeks, you got paid. But anyways, he made a comment that he could tell that some people were not doing their time card daily, that they were probably waiting till the end of the pay period after 2 weeks to go back through and quickly do their time card for each day. And I asked, well, how do you know that? And he said, well, look, the amount of hours every day is always 8 hours. So you're supposed to work a 40-hour week, so 80 hours total. But 8 hours every single day is a little weird because lots of times people have to come in a little bit later. They have a doctor's appointment, or they had to drop their kid off at daycare, or they had to leave a little bit early to go to a meeting or something like that. So this idea that every single day you work is 8 hours exactly would be a little strange. I suppose it could happen, but it wouldn't be common, at least in my experience. What's a lot more common is that, well, one day I worked 7.5 hours, and then the next day I made it up with 8.5. But as he was making the comments, you could see that some people were not doing their time card that way. They were probably waiting until the end of the pay period to put in 8 hours for each day and then just giving it to him to sign. So he did sign it, but he could have gone back to them and said, are you doing this on a daily basis? Because our time card process, our procedures were that, and our rules were that you had to do your time card daily, not wait until the end of the pay period to do your time card. Okay? So in terms of our flow of documents in a process costing system, we have our sales order, and then that sales order is turned into a production order. And then once we have that production order, we can start to order our materials from the warehouse. We can start to charge time to that job. And then we can also start to charge overhead to the job. And this is something we'll talk more about in some lecture videos for this chapter. And then we hold all of those costs in summary level at the job cost sheet. And our job cost sheet is used for helping us value our ending inventory, our finished goods, our work in process, and of course also our cost of goods sold. Okay? So let's talk about manufacturing overhead. So manufacturing overhead is an indirect product cost. I'll write that down. It's an indirect product cost. So when I say indirect product cost, what I mean is that it will show up in ending inventory. It does also show up in cost of goods sold. So it's going to show up in finished goods, work in process, and cost of goods sold. When I use the term indirect, what that means is that we can't easily trace it to the products that we make. Indirect, in this context, means that we can't easily trace the cost to the products that we make. Okay? So it'd be kind of like if you lived off campus and you had some roommates and you were all sharing an apartment, say 3 people in an apartment. What would be an example of an indirect cost associated with you and your roommates living in that apartment? Would be utilities cost. You can't trace the utilities cost to each roommate. So what do? You most likely split the utilities. You each pay a third. That's the most likely situation, right? But the whole idea is that you can't trace those utilities costs to each person. I suppose you could try, but it'd be very difficult to do so and kind of weird. So what you do is you just split it evenly. Everybody pays a third. That's probably the easier way to do it, because to try to directly trace those utilities costs to each roommate is very difficult. Same thing over here with our manufacturing overhead. Our overhead, we can't easily trace our overhead to the products that we make. So for example, rent on the factory. We can't easily trace rent on the factory to the products that we make. So we have to allocate it. Okay? So what we're going to do over here is we're going to use an allocation base to allocate manufacturing overhead to the products that we make. So to give that a little bit of context back to the roommate example, your allocation base, if you have $100 of utilities costs and you have 3 roommates, your allocation base is the number of roommates. So you just divide it by 3. And that's how much, $33.33 is how much every single roommate pays. But what if you used a different allocation base? What if you used square footage, right? So let's say that you have $100 of utilities costs and then you have 100 square feet. So it's a very small apartment. I'm just doing this to keep the math easy. So we have $100 in utilities costs and then 100 square feet. And then you have 3 roommates. It's a very small apartment. That means your utilities costs are $1 per foot. So what did I do here? I took the total overhead divided by total allocation base. And then that gives me this rate. This rate is my overhead rate. Okay? It's $1 per square foot. And let's say that roommate 1, roommate 2, and roommate 3. And roommate 1 has 50 square feet, and then the other ones have 25 square feet. Okay? How much does each person pay? Well, if we do it this way, where we have $100 of utilities costs divided by the total square footage, that gives us $1 per square foot. And then all we have to do is say, well, okay, how much of the allocation base of the square footage did each roommate use times the rate, times 1, times 1, times 1. Roommate 1 pays $50, roommate 2 pays $25, and roommate 3 pays $25. So I calculated a rate by taking overhead divided by the base, and then I multiplied that rate times the amount of allocation base, square footage, used by each roommate, and that's how I allocated out the total overhead cost. We will be doing something very similar to that with manufacturing overhead. We'll calculate an overhead rate, and then we're going to apply the overhead. Okay, so I'm going to talk more about those, how to apply overhead, the actual calculations, in the next lecture video. Thanks.